We are really pleased to welcome today Laura Schifter, who is one of the authors of the recently published book, How Did You Get Here? Students with Disabilities and Their Journeys to Harvard. She is currently an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which she also attended and received her doctorate. Laura, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you share a little bit about your background and where you are from?
Sure. So I'm from DC originally, and I actually got interested in education because I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 7, and I saw the impact that teachers had on my own educational experience, both, really positive impact of teachers who really supported me and accommodated my differences and really saw my strengths, and also some negative experiences as well, where teachers really lowered expectations for me or were unwilling to kind of recognize that I had different needs than some other students. And I really felt the impact that the teachers had on both my self-esteem and my interest in the class and my, desire to learn. And so very early on, I decided I wanted to pursue a field pursue education. And so after I graduated from college, I went and I taught elementary school in San Francisco. And then I decided I wanted to learn more about how people learn. And I ended up going to Harvard and pursuing my master's in my brain and education. I then did some work in policy and disability advocacy in DC, and then came back to Harvard to get my doctorate in education policy, which is where I got to write the book with Tom about students with disabilities and their journeys to Harvard.
You shared in your book that you have dyslexia. When did you first get diagnosed and how was it discovered?
So I was first diagnosed when I was, I think I was 7. It was like right in between 6 and 7. And, sorry, it was my parents had picked up on the fact that I wasn't reading as well as my sisters, my two older sisters. And I had developed these strategies for myself to try and get by. Like I would memorize books and I would try and just flip through the pages based off of my memory. But there were certain times that I would, be reading words that were 3 pages back instead of the words that were actually on the page. Or I would make up stories based on the picture and just try to avoid reading altogether. And so my parents knew something wasn't quite right. And at that time, they tried to have me go to the feeder school of the school that my sisters went to. But when I applied to that school, I was rejected. And the school placement people told my parents that I should be evaluated for a learning disability. And that's when I was evaluated and diagnosed with dyslexia. Right after getting diagnosed with dyslexia, my parents were told off the bat, Laura's diagnosis means that she's not going to be able to do as well as her sisters. And you should just learn to accept that. She's not going to be able to succeed as much academically. She may be happy and have a good life, but she's not really going to be successful.
And how did your parents react to that? What was their reaction?
So they were both really taken aback. I think they were happy to have a diagnosis because they saw that I was really struggling. And so at least with a diagnosis and a label, they were able to kind of figure out ways to get me help. And I had been struggling for a while. But they also really didn't believe what they were being told by these experts who were telling them that I wasn't going to be as successful or as smart as my sisters. My parents both grew up in families where they have multiple siblings, and one of the siblings kind of wasn't as successful as the other ones because of difficulties in reading, which, now looking back on it, they probably had dyslexia too, but were never diagnosed. And my mom in particular said she saw the toll that took on her brother, and, the strategies that he developed then to act out, and she always knew he was smart, and so she felt like she wanted to do as much as she could to make sure that I could get information in different ways and that I would be perceived as being smart from other people. She saw, work that I had done on puzzles and work that I had done in thinking rather than just focusing on reading, that she saw that I could be successful in things and wanted to push me in that direction.
When did you feel comfortable to start just talk about your dyslexia?
So it's kind of been a journey for me in terms of being comfortable talking about it. For a long time, I really didn't want to talk about it. I would much rather have people think that I was just a dumb blonde than admit to having a disability. My mom kind of was always pushing me to accept the fact that I had dyslexia and to learn more about it and to talk about it. So she was always willing to talk about it with other people to try and show me that it was okay.
Yeah.
But especially in middle school, I didn't want to be different than the other kids in my school. I didn't want to have this negative thing attached to me. But by the time I got to high school, I started to listen more to my mom, which I probably should have done all along. And I started talking about it more. And it was scary. I decided to start a club at my school to educate more people about learning disabilities. And the first day that I started the club, I set up the meeting, and my mom helped me, post pictures of famous people with dyslexia, like Tom Cruise and JFK, and we had it all set up, and I had food set up, and the time rolled around for the meeting and no one showed up. And I was totally mortified when that happened. Because I had put myself out there. I had told the whole school that I was dyslexic, and to get that response that no one showed up was really challenging. And then I ended up having two friends call me, and fortunately they said that they wanted to join the club so we could continue it. And then the next year after that, I spoke before the whole school about my dyslexia, which was really tough. And I felt, afterwards I got notes from some other students, and I got notes from the teachers talking about how brave it was, and that really meant a lot to me. But every time I've gone into a new situation since, it's hard to kind of decide whether or not to talk about having dyslexia, because you never know how people are going to respond to it. And there are some situations with college professors or some situations professionally where I feel like by bringing it up, there's a concern that they might lower expectations for me or assume I'm not going to be as successful as other students just because I'm telling them that I have dyslexia. So oftentimes I've made the decision not to tell people about it, especially after a bad experience. But now I've gotten to the point where I feel like, okay, I have to tell people about it because I want to make it easier for other people to be able to come out and talk about their own dyslexia or learning issues. And the only way to do that is to have more people doing it and more people being comfortable to challenge people's assumptions that kids with dyslexia can't be successful.
When did you start to feel comfortable? Well, I guess I just asked you that one. I know you spent some time teaching at an elementary school in San Francisco that you were kind of talking about before. Is that what inspired you to be a teacher?
Yeah, well, having dyslexia really inspired me to be a teacher. One thing that was interesting when I went to go teach elementary school was it was the first time I ever really learned phonics. I had never previously learned phonics. The way I learned how to read was through memorizing sight words. And so it actually really did open up a whole new world to me, like trying to teach first graders phonics when I never knew it previously, or trying to teach first graders even how to read was a real struggle for me because I felt like I didn't really have the confidence in knowing how to read myself. But I'd always been successful in math, And so I started kind of working towards helping students who are struggling in math. And that was something that really interested me because I felt very confident in the content. But then I also understood what it felt like to struggle and what it felt like to not get something. And so I feel like I could meet kids where they were and help support them in that way.
You went to Harvard for your postgraduate studies. What was your support system like there?
So my support system at Harvard was interesting. It is actually the first time I've ever gone to a school where up front I met with the disability service people right when I got in, and the disability service coordinator here was fantastic. I mean, she introduced me to a screen reader or text-to-speech technology that I had never worked with before, and that's really opened up a lot of things that I've been able to do. And she was just welcoming and accommodating, but that side of things has been great. But there's still challenges with, sometimes professors don't understand what it means to be dyslexic. Or when I first sat down with a professor to kind of give my spiel, I'm dyslexic, these are the accommodations that I'm going to have in your class. I was meeting with a first professor after I got my master's, and the thing that he said to me after I gave him my explanation was, he said, okay, well, we need to make sure that the work that you're doing here is your own work. Mm-hmm. And I was really taken aback because, I couldn't believe that he would have thought that it wouldn't have been my own work, that I got into Harvard somehow on handing in somebody else's work. And I ended up leaving that meeting in tears and calling my mom and saying, I don't think I belong at Harvard. This is not going to go well. And being really terrified about what it was going to mean for me in my first year. I was really lucky then to have my next conversation with a professor, Tom Hare, who's the co-author of the book, where his response was completely different. His response was, oh, fantastic. It's so great to have, another dyslexic in my class and different perspectives. And, do you want to write a book with me? And so it was definitely a very different experience, and it was welcoming after that. And it's been up and down, but I feel like I've also developed enough strategies on my own to find the support where I need it, when I need it.
So what is the most common trait that you found amongst the 13 students you interviewed that allowed them to succeed? You were kind of briefly mentioned that before.
Yeah, so the students that we interviewed in the book, hands down, the first thing that they said in terms of how they got to Harvard when they were asked that question was my mother. So parents really played a crucial role in the lives of these students. I think every student or all the students but one student said their parents were the number one reason that they got to Harvard and really were able to succeed. And it was things that parents did that was really, challenging low expectations that people had set for them, trying to get them information in different ways and trying to give them support, even though they didn't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about disability or what to do. They just really believed in their kids and pushed them along the way.
One of the things I've always thought is that if you go into education as your major, I've always felt that it should be mandatory to take one course in teaching somebody with special needs. And I just wanted to know what your opinion on that was.
I mean, 100%. I agree with you 100%. Kids with disabilities are being included in general education classrooms more and more. And with improvements in technology, there are a lot of things that we can do to make sure that all kids can succeed in general education. And so if you're going to be a general education teacher, in all likelihood, you're going to teach kids with disabilities and kids with special needs. And so I think the more that we can do to ensure that all teachers have that training and that support that they need before they enter the classroom, the better. If you have no idea what a reading disability is before you go in to teach first grade, what are you going to do with the 5 to 15% of your kids that are going to struggle with reading? So that's something that I think 100% that teachers need to be aware of. Even if you're a high school teacher and you're teaching history, you also need to know how to support the kids in your class that struggle with reading. So I think it's very important that we think about ways to help teachers meet the diverse needs of their students in their classroom.
In your interviews, was there a story you found particularly moving or insightful?
There were a lot. I will say that hands down. But one of the things that I think particularly resonates with me is a story about a guy named Eric who, one of the things that I think we saw across the experiences of students is as students develop strategies to deal with the situations that they're in. So, no matter what, whether the strategies are something that's taught or whether the strategies are just something that kids develop, they figure out a way to get by in their situation. And this one student, Eric, was a student who was dyslexic. He was held back in elementary school. And what ended up happening with him is he really struggled with reading, and the way that he responded is by acting out. So in class, if it came time to reading, he'd pick up the books and throw them. He'd curse at the teacher. He much preferred being a badass than struggle with reading in front of his classmates. And so he became really seen as a behavior problem in his school. And I think that happens far too often with kids, is that the way they respond when things are challenging for them is to act out. And oftentimes people, parents, teachers, adults in their lives don't really look for the reasons as to why kids are misbehaving, and they assume it's just the kid is bad or whatever it may be. And for him, it was just he was really struggling with reading, and that was his response. He ended up being placed in a separate classroom because of his behavior problems. And most of the kids in the separate classroom that he was in ended up dropping out of high school. And a lot of kids ended up in jail. And, his life could have really gone that direction. But instead, he was fortunate enough in middle school to find music and develop an engagement in music. And that was a way to get him involved and excited in school. And, I just think more that we can do if kids are acting out to figure out what really the causes are of their behaviors is really important.
What do you hope for people to get out of your book?
The thing that I think is most important, the most important lessons from our book are the facts that kids with disabilities can be successful academically. I think, far too often people believe that disability is something that's bad, and that if you're disabled, you're not smart, you're stupid, and that you can't be successful. And I think this book really challenges that notion and says, look, kids can be successful academically when the right things are in place for kids. And, a lot of the students that we interviewed, there were things that could have gone very differently in their lives. And, one teacher that didn't support them or believe in them in the way that they did, or if they had different parents that had thought differently, they could have ended up in very different places. And so I think it's more thinking about the things that we can provide and the situations that we can create to provide more opportunities for kids with disabilities to be successful.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed interviewing you a lot.
Thank you, Quinn.